Since I moved to 4K in 2016, I've been very happy with the visual quality of my videos, but there may be a way to make them even better. No, I'm not talking about 8K, no one should care about that yet. I'm talking about HDR. Increasing the contrast between the darkest and brightest possible parts of an image is one of the simplest concepts in the world, yet it's a term used to mean so many methods of achieving this effect that it's kind of masked how cool the effect can be if done properly. And by that I mean having a display which can display very dark and very bright parts at the same time. Another problem with the effect is that it looks so natural that I quickly forget I've got it on until I turn it off again and realise just how flat and muted my screen looked previously. And then of course I have to ask what the difference is between proper HDR and just a normal screen that's capable of being very bright. Because in many instances they can look similar. So I suppose it comes down to what white should look like. White, like the Word document I type my scripts on, or the text that I display over my video sometimes, or a white wall of a room, that should be white. But with HDR, that is not the brightest it can be. Instead, the brightest white it can produce is more like a sun sparkle on water, or when you drive past a window that's reflecting the sun, or when a nuclear bomb goes off in your face. So on a good screen, not only does HDR enable a white that's whiter than white, it also unlocks new shades of colours, purple in particular. I've never seen shades of purple like the ones that my HDR monitor can now display. Is it useful? Well, probably not, because like I've said, I've never needed these shades of purple before. But it's still awesome. It's like a new dimension to everything that's being displayed. So there is this habit when first getting access to an HDR screen to ramp the brightness up so high that everything looks that bright and colourful, else you feel like you're missing out on the effect, and admittedly I've been doing that quite a bit. But eventually, the novelty will wear off and I'll start using it properly. That being to use its maximum brightness and colour values sparingly, on but small parts of the screen to give it more range and depth when required. So anyway, that's a quick lowdown on what HDR is, but now I must turn to how HDR can be used to improve my videos. Because just like older 4K content, it breathes a new lease of life into older videos if you can return to it later on a better screen in 5 or 10 years time and for it to still look modern. So that's what I hope to achieve by producing HDR content now. The problem is, the world isn't ready for it. It's odd that my PlayStation 4 and TV downstairs has better HDR support than my cutting edge gaming rig does. I had my eye on the first generation of proper 4K gaming screens in 2019, but I sensibly decided to wait for the next gen before buying one, in order to allow for the support for HDR on PC to improve. And here we are in 2023 and the support for it is still abysmal, and there are untold numbers of complications. At least Windows 11 has an Auto HDR feature, which does its best to add it to non-HDR games. So it's not ideal, but it's far better than what we had before. The big problem comes with Shadowplay. Now Shadowplay is capable of capturing 4K HDR content, but for some reason it requires a restart before it kicks in. So it's very easy to switch HDR on, to boot a game up and to capture several hours of footage, only to view it all back and for the colours to be all wrong and muted because it was recorded in standard dynamic range instead. When making my video on the review of Hogwarts Legacy recently, about 3/4 of the footage I captured was in SDR, despite having played the entire game with HDR on, and that meant that a lot of the footage had weird looking colours. So when I did my review of it, where possible, I used clips that had proper HDR support. In other parts, like this one I'm showing here, it's SDR but with its brightness extended, which you can tell is happening because, rather ironically, the HDR effect is overdone instead of just being on tiny parts of the image. It also blows out all the colours in all directions, making everything seem unnaturally saturated. And then there are a few clips in that video that I rendered incorrectly, which I kept in because I thought it would be interesting to view them back with hindsight after watching this video on it, and also because it would have taken hours to re-render everything. So my PC has QuickSync, NVENC, and a 32-thread processor, and it seems that all are equally slow at rendering HDR content for some weird reason. It took 100 minutes to render a 15-minute HDR video, whereas without HDR it would have taken just 30. So it's extra hassle to edit HDR content, plus Vegas doesn't show you what it'll look like with HDR on, so when you're editing it, it looks like the whole video will be disappointingly desaturated and foggy looking. So it makes making videos less enjoyable. But then, teething issues are to be expected, aren't they? It's like sitting somebody in front of your own PC and then watching them suddenly have issues with pop-ups and stuff not working like how it should. But to you, that's normal and you found ways of working around those issues without even seeing them anymore. I know that working with 4K content comes with its own downsides, but after having worked with it for so long, I've absolutely mastered the perks of it and mitigated the downsides, and I wouldn't even consider working with anything less. Meanwhile, other content creators are still sticking to 1080p, fearful of all the horrible downsides switching to 4K would introduce. So at least by deliberately making life difficult for myself now, it's had the added perk of making normal seem very easy in comparison. And even in games which do support HDR, their cutscenes don't tend to be in HDR, and they seem to think you want white transitions between scenes to be the maximum brightness of white instead of normal white. It's already blinding and it's only going to get more so as HDR monitors get brighter. So video support for HDR is limited right now, but images are even worse. You need expensive and specialist programs to save proper HDR pictures. And I have no idea what happens when I print screen with HDR on, but something about it's wrong. So yeah, it's probably not sensible for me to create HDR content just for the hell of it. But if I'm playing games on my expensive HDR screen, then you bet I'll want to make the most of it by having HDR on, so expect my gameplay videos to be in HDR from now on for that reason. My desktop content will be more fiddly, and if I'm honest, the benefits will be less visible, so who knows what I'll do with mixed content videos, like this one. The best use for HDR videos right now would probably be on my real life recordings. But the problem is my GH5 can only capture 30 FPS with HDR on. So after all that hassle a few years ago to find a camera capable of 4K 60 FPS, if I want to use HDR then I'm back down to 30 again, unless I get the GH6. Maybe the best way I can approach this situation is to look back at my early 4K content and to see how I feel about that now. I mean, I'm proud my 4K archive goes back as far as it does, but I think the real joy from 4K came from doing it at the time, and in thinking how forward-thinking I was being. Looking back at that early stuff, it's just the same as my recent stuff, but less polished. The frustrating thing about always trying to improve is that you only ever really benchmark yourself against your previous project, yet the bloat of expectations forever expands. And like I've said, what's the point if, for now, I quickly forget whether I'm viewing HDR or SDR. But I think it'll be like 4K, where it's less about how much of a jump up it is, and more about the increased clarity with hindsight about how bad things were before. So in other words, HDR is totally not worth it. Expect more HDR content from me soon.